Hello, today I want to share about chapter 17. Okay, let's see what God promised in chapter 17. So 17 also talk about the covenant. It is very important part because God consistently mentioned the same two things that many offspring and promised land. And then in chapter 17, God also changed their name Abraham to be Abraham. Sarai become Sarah. So that is our familiar name, right? So here, let's see what is God's promise and what is the condition. In verse 4 to 6 says like this: Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. So here we can see that number one, God will make Abraham to be the father of many nations. And God promised him to make him prosperous. So we can see here consistency in content. God continually, chapter 15, 16, 17, consistently God saying promises that making his nation big, making Abraham the father of many nations. And here another thing is prosperous. God promised that to bless him. And 7 also tells us that I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generation for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your offspring after you. It is great blessing because God promised being God to Abraham's offspring. So God does not stop his covenantal relationship about many sons and then blessing and the land. It just finish at the generation of Abraham. No, God promised to extend to his next generations also. So we can see the consistency in relationship. So we can see that God make the covenant relationship with Abraham and with his offspring generation. And verse 8 tells us another promise that is consistent content is that I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojourning, all the land of Canaan, for on everlasting possessions, and I will be their God. Okay, so we can see that God affirmate that I will be their God, right? And then the last one is God promised Abraham to give the promised land, Canaan. So God consistently tells the same thing. God affirmed his promise about the nation, many sons, and the promised land. Also, God promised the blessing and the extended relational the covenant relationship. So that is God's promise. So promise is so sweet. However, here is the condition. God commanded Abraham this one. Okay. And God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generation. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. So he who is 88 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generation, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring, both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. His condition is all men's circumcision of Abraham's family. He commanded it to do the circumcision on the 8th day of the newborn baby. However, can you imagine that Abraham was 99 years old when God mentioned it? It would be very painful and hard, but obeyed. I mean about action. Abraham was 99 years old and Ishmael was 13 years old. However, all men should do it. That is God's condition about his promise. Thus, he obeyed God's condition. It is a great obedience because to keep the covenantal relationship, God followed the God's condition. Though it is painful, though it is hard to do, he did it. So, promise and condition. We have to remember God's promise and condition also. Promise is God's responsibility. Condition is our responsibility. When both are faithful, the covenant relationship can be maintained. So what is your God's promise to you? What condition God does it demand you? We should learn God's condition as well as his promise. In the covenantal relationship, both God and us should be faithful to each responsibility. And can you believe that? Because God told like this, but I will establish my covenant with Isaac. Oh, who is he? Whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. Next year? Oh, Abraham now is 99 years old. Next year, he will become 100 years. And Sarah will be 90. And then they will got the first own son. Can you believe that? Can you believe it is possible? Abraham might be hard to believe God's promise about Isaac. Nevertheless, he circumcised himself and his male family members, including Ishmael. So it is the God's timing. God's will is a many son to Abraham. God's way only through Abraham and Sarah. God's timing is now when he become 100 years old. All puzzles are ready to accomplish God's will. So, covenant. I want to ask you, what did God promise you? If you do not know it yet, it is okay. Do not worry. You should keep praying to discern God's will. Maybe now is not the timing. Continually pray to God. God will answer to you. Then another one. What did God promise you? And if you know that, do you also think God's promise sounds impossible? God promised you something, and you think it is impossible. Though you think so, you should do what God told you to do, like Abraham. Abraham, hard to believe that, but he followed God's instruction condition. So like that, if God promised, and then though you think sounds impossible, do it what God told us to do. Let's remember, God keeps his promise faithfully. Amen. So we should do our responsibility to fulfill God's condition, though it is hard and painful to do, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Number 3, do what God tells us to do, though we cannot imagine its possibility. Though we think, it cannot make it true. However, if God promised, we do it what he told us to do. So faithing forward, God teach us his promise and condition. So about the promise, we don't need to think about that because God will do that. What we have to do is to fulfill God's condition, though it is hard and painful. And then remember, though it is hard to believe, if God says, do it, because God will make it true. Thank you very much. God bless you.